G'day and welcome to Pello Talk. I'm Dave Pello and tonight we're doing a bit of an experiment. This is the first time I'm going to be doing an interview with a live audience. Now, we're not broadcasting live, but the people who are here are very real and very live and coughing. So we will do our best to make this a fun experience for everybody, and hopefully we can repeat this more often. Not only will it be, I think, a better quality video, but it'll actually become hopefully a destination kind of event that when you can have a Pello Talk Live event near you, it's something fun and different to come to, and we need more of those in politics. Welcome to the first guinea pig on the couch tonight, Nick Goyron. Now, you're a member of the Legislative Council, which is the upper house in Western Australia.
That's right. Thanks for having me on the show.
Thank you for coming. Now, how long have you been a member?
So this is my 10th year in the Western Australian Parliament. I was elected at the September 2008 election because of our system in the upper house. I started in May 2009 and very shortly I'll celebrate my 10th anniversary.
Wow, well done. Congratulations. That's not a short stint. Now, you've just gotten back from New Mexico. Is that correct?
That's right. Albuquerque in New Mexico.
Albuquerque?
Yeah.
And we think Wollongab is hard to spell. Now, at Albuquerque in New Mexico, you were attending a conference on euthanasia. What was that called? Who organised it?
Yeah, so the Euthanasia Prevention Coalition, which is a coalition of organisations across the globe. They get together usually once a year or once every 2 years, and they host a conference. This particular one was in New Mexico, one of the states in the United States, and it was there because they are a jurisdiction that's currently actively considering having an assisted suicide regime.
Now, you've actually done a lot of research into euthanasia, the pros and the cons, and my understanding is you've arrived at a position that you're opposed to liberalising laws on euthanasia. Can you, outline for us what the current options are? So the laws as they are, what are the options at end of life for residents of Western Australia?
So a Western Australian who is suffering from a chronic or a terminal illness, in Western Australia we have one of the best available around the world systems of palliative care. This system includes the provision of palliative care in people's homes, or it can take place in a hospice setting or indeed in a hospital setting. So you have those three different options.
And palliative care, for those people who've never heard that word before, basically means end-of-life care?
Yes, although it absolutely does include end-of-life care, but we also have to remember that it is available and often used for people with chronic illnesses, not only those ones with a terminal illness. So it is available for both of those categories of individuals. It is very good in Western Australia. Where we fall down in Western Australia is that it is poorly accessed around the states. We are a very, very large state, and particularly in regional and rural Western Australia, the access to it is variable. And there's a few reasons for that. The size of our geography. The second thing is the level of knowledge, particularly of GPs, general practitioners. A lot of them have been trained many decades ago and are not familiar with the most modern, specialised, expertly practiced palliative care procedures. And so we find the evidence is clear that the access to it is variable. And so certainly my aspiration is that every Western Australian has access to expertly practiced specialist palliative care if they need it.
It seems tragic to me that we're exploring radical solutions to problems that already have far less radical solutions that are just either not known or not implemented or not funded properly.
Yes, look, even if you are a proponent of assisted suicide and so-called voluntary euthanasia, at best it is premature. In Western Australia, we absolutely must get to the place where ordinary Western Australians can access specialist palliative care before we even contemplate opening up a regime of assisted suicide.
Yeah. So is that one option for end of life?
Yeah, access to medical treatment is one of the options that are available. Refusal of medical treatment is an option that's available to people. People obviously are not obliged to eat and to drink, so you can withdraw those types of care options.
Mm-hmm.
Those things are all available to Western Australians at the moment, and I should add, so is suicide. Now, in the case of suicide, it is legal in Western Australia. Quite rightly, the Western Australian Parliament and governments of various persuasions have never condoned it, never endorsed it, never encouraged it. Indeed, we spend a lot of money in suicide prevention strategies, but we have to be honest and recognise that it is a choice, it is an option available to people at end of life. Unlike the other options, of course, we don't encourage it, we don't endorse it, we don't support it.
We actively try and solve it.
Indeed.
Yeah. Now, what do you see as the risks? The proposed legislation is being drafted, yes?
Well, that's a matter for the government.
It's not drafted yet?
They haven't disclosed it. I don't believe that they have drafted it, but they are in the process of considering what to put in the draft.
Right.
Yeah.
So the legislation can take a variety of shapes and sizes, and they would be aiming to have an ideal, safe kind of legislation which liberalises euthanasia and assisted suicide.
Yes.
What would be the potential risks that you think that legislation should try to guard against or cannot guard against?
The risks are enormous, and I'll give you one example. Prior to my 10 years in Parliament, I was a lawyer for 10 years, and one of the areas of practice that I was involved in was medical negligence law.
Mm.
Now, you can either act for the plaintiff or you can act for the defendant. I was acting for the plaintiff. In other words, the clients who were alleging that medical negligence had occurred. Now, in all of the cases that I had handled, I can say categorically that from that experience, doctors make mistakes.
Mm.
Doctors are not infallible. And the problem with these euthanasia and assisted suicide regimes is that everyone, including the proponents, says, oh, you must have safeguards. But the safeguards are only as good as the doctor who enforces it.
Mm.
Usually there's two doctors that are involved in the process. Well, it only takes one of them to get it wrong or to miss something to ensure that the safeguard has fallen away. So my experience in medical negligence law tells me that two doctors is a completely inadequate safeguard when the outcome, if they get it wrong, is a wrongful death of which there can never be any redress or recourse for the person.
Yeah, it's pretty hard to receive compensation when you're not here.
There's no second chances.
Yeah, definitely. In your study, in your research, in your travels, what examples have you seen in jurisdictions around the world where they've gone down this rabbit trail and they've experimented or flirted or fully pursued the legislation that the West Australian Parliament is now being asked to consider?
Yeah.
How's it worked overseas? Because I've heard I'll call it generously propaganda from the pro-euthanasia lobby, who are saying that all the examples overseas say it works wonderfully.
Well, that can only be said by a person who's never looked at any of those jurisdictions. There's 14 jurisdictions, only 14 I might add, across the whole world. There are 14 jurisdictions where this takes place at the moment. Now, I'll start with the Netherlands. Usually we start this conversation in Europe because they were effectively the first country to go down this path. Now, what often happens when you bring up the Netherlands is that somebody like me will say, well, you realise that in the Netherlands that we wouldn't want to do what they do there, because they actually allow euthanasia for the mentally ill. So the proponent will very quickly say, well, look, let's move on from the Netherlands. Let's go to Belgium. I'll say, terrific. You realise in Belgium that originally it was only available for adults, and then the Parliament changed the law to allow it for children. Okay, well, that's no good. We won't do the Belgian model then, will we? Okay, well, where should we go next? How about Oregon in the United States? And there I will say to them, well, you realise that the data in Oregon from their own health commission confirms that people are taking the poison sometimes years after they were originally given the dose or the prescription. Now keep in mind that in Oregon you're only supposed to be able to access it if you've got 6 months to live. Well, how do you explain somebody taking it 2 years later if they were only supposed to have 6 months to live?
Well, it has to be either errors in administration,
prognosis,
or errors in prognosis.
Absolutely. And so in Oregon, we know from their own data.
So much for the safe laws.
Well, it makes it clear that safeguards are a myth in Oregon. You've got the problems with prognosis. You've got complications. Sometimes people think, oh, this euthanasia procedure is going to be very peaceful. There'll be no complications. Well, the results from Oregon tell us otherwise. And perhaps what's the worst in Oregon is that there is systemic doctor shopping. So if you don't get the right answer from the doctor that you want, remember you need 2 doctors to agree, well, you just keep shopping until eventually you get a doctor who agrees with you.
Do they become known of who to go to for the right answer?
So much so that in some of these jurisdictions it's now being effectively commercialised, where they have an organisation that will say, look, come to us. If you can't get any success from your local doctor, come to us, we will sort this for you. So these are the so-called safeguards in those particular jurisdictions. And in the end, with the proponents, they duck and they dive and they try and skirt these issues. And I'll just say to them, look, whatever you might think about the Dutch or the model in Belgium or in Switzerland, where effectively there's virtually no rules there, or what some of the American states are doing, what I would ask you to consider is, well, is there an Australian experience that can inform us here? And of course, we did once have a very short experiment in Australia in the Northern Territory.
And?
Well, the Northern Territory experience should be enough for any parliamentarian to immediately know you don't want to go down this path.
Why not? What happened?
Well, there were a number of casualties, a number of wrongful deaths. So I'll give you
wrongful deaths.
Wrongful deaths in the sense that, remember, there are these safeguards. So if the safeguards are not fulfilled properly, then therefore it would be a wrongful death. The one example I'll give you this evening is the case of a patient had a condition, mycosis fungoides. It's like a cancer in the blood and affects the skin. It's a serious condition. Now remember, 2 doctors needed to sign off on this euthanasia procedure. The first doctor, of course, was a very well-known doctor, Philip Nischke, who's a massive proponent of euthanasia, very intellectually honest. I mean, this is a person who will admit that you will have casualties if you have things like this. So he was doctor number 1. Now the second doctor needed to have some experience or qualification in the underlying condition. Now Nischke went around looking for a second doctor to sign off on this, but the oncologist and the dermatologists said, no, this is not a terminal condition, we're not signing off on this. So out of desperation, who do they get as a second doctor? Now remember, mycosis fungoides, cancer in the blood, affects the skin. The second doctor was an orthopaedic surgeon. Now I love to go and see an orthopaedic surgeon when I've got a problem with my back, but I don't go and see an orthopaedic surgeon when I've got mycosis fungoides and cancer
skin
in the blood. Absolutely not. And that was the so-called safeguard. Now, if that's not bad enough to demonstrate how easy it is to go doctor shopping and effectively ignore the law, well, and who's going to complain after the event? Because your key witness is now dead. If that's not bad enough, this was a person who had depression and depressive symptoms. So when I know that that is the lived experience in my own country, it tells me that this is a regime where casualties are guaranteed.
It's sobering, and I don't know how anybody can say there's no problems anywhere that this has been tried before.
Well, they only say that when they don't look.
Yeah.
So I was involved in a parliamentary inquiry for 12 months. I was the only one of the 8 members of Parliament to attend every meeting and every hearing. I'm the only one of the 8 members who's a co-chair of the Parliamentary Friends of Palliative Care, and I'm the only one of the 8 who previously practiced medical negligence law. Now, out of the 8 of us, I was the one who then tabled a 248-page minority report. And what disturbed me the most about what the rest of the committee did, apart from the fact that they didn't attend all the meetings and hearings, is that in no part of the committee report do they look at the wrongful deaths in the other jurisdictions. Now, I don't mind if people have a different point of view to me. That's the wonderful thing about our democracy.
Yeah.
But for goodness sake, at least go and have a look at the wrongful deaths in the other jurisdictions.
Dissent is allowed, ignorance is unforgivable.
Well, in this case, it's reprehensible.
Absolutely. We're going to take a short break, and when we come back, we'll be joined by an expert in the medical industry and profession. Welcome back to Pello Talk. We're discussing euthanasia in the West. In Western Australia, the current Parliament is proposing drafting some legislation to liberalise euthanasia and assisted suicide. And joining me now is another guest, Professor Phil Bircham. Welcome, Phil. How are you?
Thank you very much, Dave.
Now, you're a professor in pharmacology. Is that all?
I'm actually an associate professor.
An associate professor?
Yeah. In pharmacology and toxicology.
I just gave you a promotion.
Thanks very much. I'll check my bank account later.
So, sorry, pharmacology and
toxicology.
And toxicology. Okay. And you're obviously a medical professional, doctor, basic?
I'm actually a scientist trained in pharmacology and toxicology. Okay. So my professional interest is making sure that we're using drugs as safely as possible. We've come a long way in the last 150 years with advances in chemistry, biology, and making better pharmaceuticals.
Yeah, sure.
But of course, every drug has a potential to cause harm as well as beneficial effects. So toxicologists have the job of trying to make sort of new generations of drugs, just as we have new second-gen, third-gen phones that are better than the old ones.
Yeah.
Second, third, fourth-gen drugs are usually safer and more effective than earlier ones. So that's how I got interested in this issue of euthanasia, because my whole career has been motivated by a desire to minimise harm caused by pharmaceuticals, and now we're being told, and protect human life.
Yeah.
And now we're being told that we're going to use drugs to kill people deliberately. Yeah. I mean, that's a real corruption of medical research and the practice of medicine, in my view.
It does seem to me to be a fundamental break between the relationship between medicine, doctors, carers, and their patients, the society as a whole, that we all of a sudden introduce this element where death is a therapeutic option. And if you're a patient who is perhaps at the end of, let's say the last decade or two of your life, to think that that's one of the options your doctor might be recommending for you or considering as a possibility, has to just fundamentally change the doctor-patient relationship.
I think it really corrupts the practice of medicine. It really undermines trust in your doctor when you know that they are interested in ending your life. I think it's, I can even speak personally on that matter because our families live with a genetic condition for many generations, and we had a daughter born 21 years ago who was affected by our condition. I live with it too. It doesn't affect us too badly. We still get by with our life, but we were sort of tricked into going into a appointment with a genetic counsellor by some paediatricians who sort of led us to believe, and this was in a major Eastern Australian hospital, led us to believe that we were going to see a doctor who was interested in treating our daughter. And when we got there, we found out they were only interested in making sure we didn't have any more children like her, and our daughter was treated openly with contempt. And
that's horrible.
I have an emotional involvement in this issue because I think, my respect for paediatricians went from up there to down there in the twinkling of an eye.
Yeah.
And I think once, people who specialise in geriatric medicine, caring for people in the late stages of life.
Yeah.
If the word gets out that they really want to end your life, I mean, that's going to really corrupt the practice of gerontology.
And I have the highest regard for doctors. It's a noble profession, and that has to be stipulated because one of the things I think we're highlighting tonight is the potential for bad doctors, for exceptions to the rule, and you know, having made that stipulation, there are no shortage of anecdotes. Anybody has probably heard of bad treatment. You know, if I was actually just following a thread on Twitter today where somebody asked about experiences with miscarriage, and lots of people, lots of women were talking about the absolute callousness that they'd received at the hands of medical professionals. And so add that potential, might be a 1% chance of the 1% or less, but there's a fraction of the medical profession where there are less than perfect people involved with character deficiencies that make the scenario where death is added as a therapeutic option a frightening prospect. Have you heard of any scenarios, Phil, where the drugs that have been provided to help someone kill themselves, so assisted suicide, here's your drugs, go find a park or go home and in your own time and peace do what you want to do. Have you heard any horror stories?
18 months or so ago, we had a visit from a good friend of mine who's a palliative care physician in Oregon, and he's recently retired. But
it's a tough place to be in that business.
Yeah, and he told me some pretty shocking stories of his experiences. And he spoke of that general corruption of his career that followed in the wake of the Death with Dignity Bill in Oregon, because it immediately sort of segregated his patients into three basic groups. Firstly, there was one group of families who wanted to use the Death with Dignity Bill to get rid of unwanted elderly relatives. He thought that was about a third of his interactions. But at the other end of the extreme, about a third of the families felt that they'd completely lost trust in the medical profession, and every time he wanted to prescribe a drug, even with good intent to alleviate suffering, appropriately, the families were treating him very distrustfully and didn't want him coming near their loved ones with a syringe, and so, and then the remaining third sort of fell in the middle and didn't really care either way or the other. But it sort of it polarised the patient community, and for his mind, that sort of made medicine less enjoyable and less rewarding. And that's an important point to make, because medical journals are full of studies of high rates of burnout in the medical profession, high rates of suicide, high rates of marriage failure, all sorts of problems. Doctors are wonderful people, they're very driven people, but they're also exposed on a daily basis to often the worst that life throws at us, day in, day out. It's a very demanding career. And I think if we go down this route of putting the power of life or death in their hands, it's only going to increase those sort of pressures for many doctors.
And David, the doctors, as we discussed earlier, they can make mistakes, but also some of them will have a bias. And so how easy is it for them to steer someone into a particular decision? I mean, here you have an associate professor who had to sort of, push back against the medical fraternity with regard to your own family. So a very well-educated person, who's probably got the self-esteem and the self-confidence to push back, and also the medical knowledge and the scientific knowledge to say, well, hang on a second, what you're telling me is not quite right.
Yeah, it's such a good point.
What happens if you're not in Phil's situation?
How many people are not confident to argue with their doctor?
And so they get steered into a particular direction,
Not confident and not equipped to argue with the doctor and push back.
Yeah.
And I think, and the other side of it is too, it can't help but corrupt clinical knowledge, because we've come so far in pharmacology. We've got some pretty terrific painkillers now that we wouldn't have had, even 60 or 70 years ago. So, and we've come a long way in understanding how to use those drugs effectively to alleviate pain, especially even during the dying process. But when we say we're just going to end someone's life with a drug, we're really saying we don't want to provide clinical care for that person in the final stages of their life. And we're making ourselves, in a way, dumber, I think, by doing that.
Because you're no longer looking for solutions.
We're no longer looking for solutions. We're no longer trying to make things better.
Yeah.
And
tell me, can you even roughly quantify what percentage of people at end of life who might be looking for availing themselves of this legislation if it enacts, what percentage of people can't be made comfortable? Where their suffering is too extreme, their conditions are too unaccessible by medication? What percentage of people can't be helped, and possibly this would be more compassionate for, in some views?
Yeah, look, to my mind, it's only a few percent of patients at best.
1 or 2?
Yeah, I would think so. I mean, Nick might have an opinion on that.
Yeah, well, that they often quote 2%. That's the commonly used percentage. But understand where the 2% comes from. The 2% is data that has been collected that takes into account all of the cases. So in other words, the bad providers and the good providers are all put into the same data set, into the same...
The people who aren't good at palliative care.
Or have made mistakes. I remember during the inquiry we had one of the specialists come and speak to us, and he was horrified. He comes into a room and he's seen this patient and she's, you know, almost like blown up like a balloon full of fluid, and he's saying, what are you guys doing here? Now I think to myself, well, what would have happened if that particular person, that specialist, had not intervened in that particular case? What would have happened is that the patient would have had a horrible death. The family would have seen that and said, well, if this is the best that palliative care can provide, we want euthanasia, thanks. Well, it wasn't the best that euthanasia could provide. Thankfully, palliative care could provide it. It was just so happened...
It was a failure.
It was, yeah, and thankfully in this case it was remedied. But think of how many other times there would be a case where it wasn't remedied. So the 2% is an average figure. It's not talking about what would happen if you have access to expertly practiced specialist palliative care. And I'm yet to find somebody who can demonstrate to me that if you get an expert specialist practicing, that they are unable to treat a particular condition.
Wow. Okay. Well, we'll be right back after this break with our final guest for the evening. Welcome back to Pallo Talk. Thanks for watching, and thanks for watching this long if you're still with us. This is a very important discussion, and it can be a very difficult discussion and a very emotive discussion. And it's really important that we acknowledge those emotions but don't make irrational decisions. We have to be objective about this. And so the truth is probably the most important thing here, because the laws that are considered, if passed, will affect the entire society that's under them. And the laws aren't made for individuals. My next guest tonight, though, is Bill Muhlenberg. Bill Muhlenberg has been on Pallo Talk twice already, repeat offender, and he was a must invite for tonight, A, because he happened to be in Perth, which was a happy coincidence, and B, because he's actually written a book on euthanasia, The Challenge of Euthanasia. And you can grab that from billmuhlenberg.com. No AU?
No.
billmuhlenberg.com. So there's lots of other books that he's written, and he is an absolutely prolific contributor to the cultural discussions and debates going on in Australia. Sometimes 2 articles a day, as well as many books and many media appearances. So Bill, thank you for joining us tonight.
Thank you for having me.
First applause. The first 2 guests didn't rate.
We're locals. We're locals.
2 East Coast, 2 West Coast. It's great being here at Sheridan College tonight. But Bill, you've actually lived in some of these nations that are now jurisdictions with legalised euthanasia and assisted suicide.
Yep.
Firstly, what was the welcome like in anticipation of the liberalisation of euthanasia laws in the Netherlands?
Well, it wasn't all that welcome, certainly for many elderly people. Mind you, I lived there about 5 years in the 80s, so that preceded when the actual legalization took place.
But people were already
Well, yeah, well, that's the whole point. Even then, there were a lot of people who were very worried indeed. We had many elderly people, for example, moving to Belgium, which was a bad move because in 2002, both the Netherlands and Belgium legalized euthanasia.
Wow.
But yeah, they're going to Germany or other countries because they really were worried. If I go see my doctor for some health issue, do I know I'm even going to come back? So even back in the 80s and 90s, this was a real concern for many of the elderly. And of course, now that it has been legalized, it's just mushroomed since then. One of the government reports, the Remelink report, was already sounding ominous notes quite a while ago as to how, despite all the promises of strict safeguards, it's open slather once you
Doesn't
open the
Andrew
door.
Denton say that the Remelink report was a glowing endorsement of those laws?
Well, he obviously hasn't read it. It was very much concerned even back then about the the main thing being the number of people who were being bumped off who didn't specifically ask for it, many against their will. And so, again, that was going back 20 years ago. Let's look at today.
And the Dutch keep pretty good records, don't they?
Well, they're good at some things, and record keeping is certainly one of them. So we should be learning from their experience. Something like 30% of all euthanasia deaths now in Holland are, well, they're not volitional, they're not voluntary. They're being either forced upon them by some family members, by doctors, medical community. So something like around 10% of all deaths in Holland now due to euthanasia. Belgium, again, these are small countries, but still the figures are shocking. 250% increase in Belgium in the last 10 years of euthanasia deaths. Something almost 2,500 last year in Belgium. Again, small country. So the numbers are quite alarming. And yet we keep not learning from these experiences.
So 2,500.
Roughly in the last year.
And 30% of those were involuntary?
Sorry, I first began with Holland. 30%.
Is it fair to assume a similar?
Well, look, it would be. The countries are very similar in many ways. And so, yeah, probably the figures in Belgium would be just about in that camp, yeah.
So,
Scary.
what's that, 750?
Well, yeah.
Ballpark. Good question. How many involuntary euthanasia deaths is an acceptable number?
Well, it should be 0. The proponents will quickly jump on the use of the language involuntary and start to discuss the difference between involuntary and without consent. But look, without getting into the...
Well, I'm interested in what the rebuttals are to our arguments.
Yes.
Like, what are they going to say? Because we don't have a euthanasia advocate here speaking for them. So what is their rebuttal to?
Well, they would say that those deaths that you're talking about are people who are unable to provide consent, and so a decision is being made on their behalf, and so then they will effectively say, well, is that involuntary or is that somebody not being able to provide consent? Now,
seems like semantics to me.
well, I think that you've got a case there, because in the end we're supposed to provide informed consent for any medical procedure. And yes, it is true that if you lose capacity, that family members, depending on the hierarchy, can make decisions on your behalf. Or if you have signed an advanced health directive, then the doctors should abide by those arrangements that you've made, those directives that you've made. That is true. But should somebody else be terminating your life or making that decision without your consent? Indeed, in the Netherlands, there was the case recently where somebody had expressed a desire for euthanasia, subsequently lost capacity, and they proceeded, the family and the doctor proceeded to the point of holding the patient down, and the patient says, no, I don't want to do this. Now, even if you think that she provided
and they
consent
finished the
previously,
procedure anyway.
Oh yes,
despite her.
she's dead. But even if you think that it was, her wishes should be respected initially, when somebody says to you, no, stop, don't continue with this lethal injection, the fact that they could even continue after that, and then people still defend it, I think if you're defending that, really, you're a lost cause on this debate.
I think just from my perspective, the case for without consent care is justified when it's a life-saving measure. If somebody's unable to say, yes, please amputate my leg, if that's the only thing that's possible to save my life, if they're not able to give that consent, I think it's fair to assume they would want life-saving measures. I think it's highly irrational to suggest that without the ability to give consent, you can infer they would want to die.
Worse when we've got an inheritance impatience problem amongst some people in our community. So some of these people are in such a hurry to access their inheritance. Where is the safeguard to ensure that that isn't influencing the decision that's being made? And how could you ever police something like that?
Yeah.
Hence why you just simply can't have a regime, because the regime will always be inherently unsafe.
Now, you've lived in America as well. Did you live near Oregon or in Oregon?
Well, I lived in Washington, just next to Oregon, for a short time. Mind you, I lived in New Mexico as well for a while, which is now debating it. Look, same thing. All these jurisdictions, strict safeguards, don't worry, no slippery slope, there's not going to be any problems. Oregon is really the test case of how bad things can be, and it's getting worse all the time. As we say, children becoming more routine, certainly the mentally ill.
They're euthanizing children in Oregon.
Well, I think that's limited to the Netherlands and Belgium, but in Oregon they certainly
they've been calls by some Oregon politicians for this to start happening.
Yes.
And this is the danger. Like, you might be saying these are really safe laws now, but who are the politicians going to be in the next parliament, and what are they going to call for? Because now the bell has rung, society has changed. Fundamentally, we accept death as therapy. And it's a small step there, not a big step like we're considering now. A small step to go, what about kids? If it's compassionate for adults, why isn't it compassionate for kids?
And again, certainly the Netherlands or Belgium happening, but bear in mind some of our Australians. We've mentioned Nitsky. In my book, actually, I documented about 20 years ago, he was in the States. He actually did an interview with a conservative magazine. And back then, he was seriously proposing we should be selling suicide pills in the supermarkets, right? So you get your 15-year-old girl just broke up with her boyfriend, depressed, bummed out, goes into the supermarket, gets whatever, a pack of donuts, and there's the suicide pills. I mean, come on, the West has got these huge problems with youth suicide, and some of our biggest advocates of euthanasia, well, at least they're candid. They're honest about what they want to do. This is not about end of life, terminal cases, just the hard few cases. This is they want open slather, and they're quite clear about that.
It seems to be just totally split personality, that society is on one hand saying suicide is a problem, here's the suicide hotline, don't hurt yourself, are you okay day, and let's make it easier for people to kill themselves. Boy.
And the proponents never engage on that distinction. So why is it that an able-bodied person, we would straight away say, oh, no, under no circumstances, jump off the bridge or take that poison or anything like that. We want you to access our prevention strategies and call the hotline and the helpline and so forth. But if the person has a chronic or terminal illness, suddenly we say, well, actually, that helpline's not really for you. Let's open the door. How about we get 2 doctors to sign off on your death?
We agree your life is less worth.
Well, that has to be the implication.
And this is the problem.
I think another aspect of all this that worries me is that so much of the appeal of the euthanasia argument rests on this idea of autonomy, and I think we've got a really toxic view of autonomy in the Western world at the moment. It's tearing us apart, and in many ways, it's nonsense to think that we're autonomous creatures. I didn't control the day I was born or where I was born, who my parents were. I couldn't control my skin colour or my ethnicity. All of that was beyond my control, and yet we seem to cling to this idea that I'm going to control how I leave this planet. And the danger of that way of thinking is that it actually neglects the fact that we're really created to be social creatures. Sociality is a really important part of human existence.
Right.
And it's by seeing my neighbours struggle successfully with the hardships that life throws at every one of us that we become stronger, more persistent, more resilient individuals. And one of the things that's fascinating about these American states that have legalised euthanasia, and Aaron Kheriaty, he's a academic, teaches clinical psychiatry at the University of California, Irvine, has drawn attention to this. He calls it the social contagion theory, that once you legalise physician-assisted suicide, there is an inevitable increase in suicide rates, generalised suicide rates in those American states where PAS has been legalised.
Because the laws
and
send a
it's this
signal
loss
to
of
the
resilience,
society.
life's too hard for me, I may as well knock myself off. That ripples through communities. And the press has known this for a long time. You know, the press has had these restrictions on when a famous person commits suicide, they won't put the details in the media, because it's known that famous suicides have ripple effects in society, and this is one really sad aspect of euthanasia in my view.
Yeah, one of the ironies about the use of autonomy as an argument is that when we go back to the existing choices that are available to Western Australians, as an autonomous individual, it is true that you have the liberty to suicide. You do have that autonomy and you do have that liberty. What they're asking us to give is a license for suicide, and it cannot be an autonomous act if you rely on somebody else. You need the doctor. You need the doctor to give you the injection or to give you the cup of poison. So at that point, it's no longer a strictly autonomous act. And this goes to your point that we are an interdependent society. And again, this is an important philosophical discussion that is never engaged with by the other side. All they do is they say autonomy is king. In fact, would you believe that the title of the committee report in the Western Australian Parliament was "My Life, My Choice"? Well, if that's really the mantra and the motto, why do we have suicide prevention initiatives in Western Australia? It makes no sense.
It a slightly humorous but effective illustration of the preposterous proposition that the law only affects you if it's your choice is the assertion that perhaps we should make it possible for someone to pee at one end of the pool. But that always affects everybody. It's just not possible to make a law just for you to pee at your end of the pool. It's going to affect everybody, whether you like it or not. Laws cannot be made for individuals. Laws are made because decisions affect everybody in the pool.
Yeah, that's true.
Bill, tell us a little bit about your book. Do you want to? I'm sure you read it, but
had a look at it at one point. Look, it's a series of books I've been doing on the hot potato ethical issues, the kind of things you're not supposed to talk about in polite society. So I did a few on homosexuality already. I did one on abortion. So this is one of the more recent ones. And like all of the books I've done, they're kind of in two parts. The first half is simply all the secular data, so medical, scientific, nothing whatsoever religious. So if you've got non-Christian friends or you're a non-Christian watching this right now, you say, give me a good secular case for why I should be concerned about, well, in this case, legalizing euthanasia or abortion and so on. Well, hopefully it's all there. Second half of the book, however, for those who are of a more religious bent, well, then I'll give you the biblical theological arguments as well. So, if you're Joe Pagan, rip the second half of the book, throw it away, keep the first half. So
I would thoroughly recommend, if you're considering leaving this life, and entering the next, you might want to read both halves.
Probably you should. Yes. So yeah, I mean, we need to be able to do both. Obviously, if you're going on the secular media, you can't just run with a lot of Bible verses. It won't cut.
Right.
So if you go on Q&A on a Monday night, you need to know your secular argument.
I think you'd want to be incredibly confident that there's absolutely, certainly nothing after this life.
Well, sure. Yeah.
If you're absolutely sure that this is as bad as it gets.
Well, that's right. But for those, a secular society where that kind of argument doesn't cut it, well, we need to have the facts. We need the stats, the figures, and so on. We need to look at what's been happening overseas. Benelux is your starting point, but American jurisdictions, it's getting quite frightening. And it's not just numbers, but as you say, the stories. Put a human face to some of these stories where people don't want to be put down, but they are being, sometimes again, by their own family members, eager for that inheritance. So this is not just, theoretical stuff. This is happening constantly in my own state of Victoria. Sadly, we went down this path as well last year. Dan Andrews, the Premier, he said, we'll have the strictest guidelines and safeguards in the world. The very moment you effectively smash the basis of medicine, do no harm, right? Which is exactly what you do when you legalize euthanasia. You've already undercut yourself on any kind of safeguards. The whole thing is gone. All you have left is the slippery slope.
The funny thing about that is that in Western Australia, the government is proposing to base the legislation that it is in the process of drafting on the Victorian model, and yet Victoria is yet to commence. It's going to commence in a couple of months' time. So before we even have any lived experience, I mean, I'm confident that there will be casualties in Victoria.
Of course.
Okay, but imagine that for a moment I'm wrong.
Has there ever been a jurisdiction where there have been no casualties?
Absolutely not. In every single jurisdiction there are wrongful deaths. But imagine for the moment that, let's give them the benefit of the doubt, the Victorians have invented the one and only ever created safe system of euthanasia. Wouldn't we want to wait and make sure that they got it right before we go down that path?
Give it a few years.
Are there any obvious problems that you've seen in the bill that will be enacted in Victoria, other than your opposition to euthanasia?
Well, again, at the outset, it's about the guarantee that safeguards will fail because it's relying on a group of fallible individuals.
But other than general objections, is there anything specific in the Victorian legislation that you can think, oh wow, that I know the premise of the question is there a good model of legislation, but are there any particular, like, wow, they legislated that?
Well, bear in mind, both our 2008 abortion law, which was not only the worst in Australia, but...
You say our because you're from the socialist
Victoria,
state of Victoria.
Yes, People's Republic of Victoria, that's right, with a K and not a... 2008, Victoria passed this incredibly bad abortion law, which was amongst the most liberalised in the world, and similar now with the euthanasia law. In both cases, the numbers sadly weren't with our side. We couldn't mount the numbers to defeat it. So a number of amendments in both the abortion law and the euthanasia law were put forward. I mean, sensible. Not even radical amendments, not suing doctors who may have conscientious objection to providing abortion to a patient or even referring for abortion and so on. Every single one of those amendments in both the abortion and euthanasia bill were knocked back. I mean, even sensible things, which even some of the proponents, in
Have
theory...
you got any examples in mind that you can recall?
Well, as I say, simply protecting the doctor, a pharmacist, a nurse, those
from conscientious objection.
Well, that's right. All that was put up, all that was defeated. So if you follow suit, it's not going to be good.
No.
Wow. That's...
Can I just bring up another thing too? You raise the issue of religion, and I know we're good Australians and we're not allowed to talk about religion in public, but I think there is a religious dimension to my concern because one of the things I'm interested in is the history of my field and the history of medicine, in particular the use of drugs. And one of the things you find in the Greco-Roman world, which Peter Singer, of course, is a great enthusiast for getting rid of all that influence of Christianity. That is an influential philosopher from Australia who wants us to go back to a Greco-Roman worldview. But you look at the Greco-Roman world, one of the things we find that there was a very low respect for the sanctity of human life. And poisoning was a big part of Greco-Roman society. In fact, they had law courts that dealt with nothing else than poisoning cases because people were all poisoning each other. And there are even the forerunners of today's pharmacists, the pharmacia, were actually specialists in using concoctions to kill people, to induce hallucinations, but also to help you if you were sick. And one of the things that the early Christian leaders stood against when they came into contact with the Greco-Roman worldview, Paul and the great Christian leader, and also John, both of them prohibited pharmakia, this practice of using God's good gifts, God's medicines, in an illicit way to take life. And so, in a way, what we're doing in the euthanasia debate is we're putting society back thousands of years because it was actually the influence of that Christian
another attack on the foundations of
laid the foundations for medical science. And
wow.
I think we're doing something really dangerous and really dumb.
Yeah. Nick, one of the questions from the audience tonight is how affordable is palliative care in Western Australia at the moment to ordinary people?
It is available to Western Australians largely at no cost to them, but to the taxpayer it's incredibly expensive. And I would say that if we are a truly compassionate society, we should be willing and be prepared to pay for every Western Australian who is in need of palliative care to have access to it. So,
is it sufficiently funded by the West Australian government?
Absolutely not. And that's not a criticism necessarily of the current government because they've inherited it from previous governments, of course. But we know that when we compare the number of palliative care specialists that we have in Western Australia compared to other jurisdictions in Australia, we need at least double, but depending on who you talk to, up to quadruple the amount that we have at the moment. So we're miles off. And at the very least, we need to get that right before we even start this conversation.
Exactly. That seems obvious. How can you not fully fund the solutions that are currently available before you entertain more solutions, let alone such fatal solutions?
Well, otherwise it's a fake choice because you're effectively steering a person.
That's what you were saying before.
To
It's quitting.
choice.
We're giving up. We're robbing ourselves of intelligence and achievements that are within our reach. What's the technical difference? Phil, I'll ask you this question. What's the distinctions between euthanasia and assisted suicide, and what are the ethical implications or problems varying between each?
I'm not sure there is a really profound difference there. I mean, Nick might be in a better position to answer that, but it assumes a difference. Euthanasia implies an act being done on someone to kill them. Physician-assisted suicide implies that you're the one, the doctor provides the medication and you take it. But,
that's exactly right.
of course, my friend in Oregon says many of the people who are going through the death with dignity process have things like motor neuron disease. They're unable to pick up a vial of poison. So who's giving it to them is a good question. And it's probably poor old nurses that have been given the job, contrary to the ethos of their profession as well, given the job to hold the stuff up to the mouth of the poor old patient that can't pick it up for themselves. So I'm not sure there's a distinction there. But
no, that's exactly right. And in the end, someone has to execute the act. So it's either the doctor or the medical professional, or it's the patient themselves. But the patient obviously needs assistance, and so there you get assisted suicide is when the doctor has prepared the concoction.
I've heard of people. In fact, I've interviewed people whose family members have been assisted to kill themselves in Germany and other places. And some of the stories are they've done it by themselves and it's been later discovered it took them like a day or two.
Oh, yeah.
Agonising because it just wasn't done properly.
Yeah, but now you're talking facts. You see, in this debate,
My mistake.
yeah, in this debate, all we ever do is we hear about the peaceful pill, and how it's all going to be a very soothing and beautiful process.
Dignified. Dignified death.
If humans were so excellent at being able to kill another human with poisons and the like, why is it that in America that there are all these states that are repealing their capital punishment laws because of the implication for the person who's being executed? Because it's messy, it's complicated. Complications are a real issue here, but it never gets discussed. It's inconvenient.
Can the question be asked about euthanasia for those people in pain or a lot of pain who just want to be out of pain, comparing that to the palliative care option, which allows the person to receive morphine, which takes away the pain and can lead to someone passing away from the morphine?
Well, yes. Well, Catholic moral theology and even others used to speak of the principle of double effect, where you do one thing for a certain reason and you get a secondary outcome.
That wasn't intended.
Well, that's right. And to keep it from being airy-fairy, my mother, right, some years ago died of a kind of a slow, painful death of cancer. She had morphine, right? Well, the idea of morphine is pain relief, but sometimes it can have the secondary impact of hastening death. That, well, if you're a good doctor, that's not why you administer it. You're trying to relieve the pain, or at least as much as you can. But sometimes that can be another impact from it. So part of it has to do with your intention. What is your aim? And that's really the heart of the euthanasia debate. It's what is your intent? Is it to deliberately and perhaps prematurely take the life of a person? The intention there is to take a life, whereas normally administering morphine for pain relief, that is not your intention.
And during the inquiry, we had evidence taken from Philip Nishke, very well known, high profile euthanasia
Ideologue.
Yes, proponent and in fact practitioner, I would say. Now he said to the committee, his words, not mine, that it's very hard to kill someone with morphine, hence why he doesn't use it. So this whole talk about people dying of morphine is yet another myth. If it is properly titrated by a specialist, it does not hasten a person's death. The problem is that a lot of family members have seen their relative die, perhaps in a short period of time after they've received an injection of morphine, and they immediately connect the injection with the death, rather than understanding that the injection has helped them to have a peaceful, a calm, a relaxed death, but it wasn't the morphine injection that killed them, because it was properly titrated, but it made them comfortable during that
What's titrated mean?
So you basically start low in your dosage, and then you continue to up as is required, and that is controlled carefully by the experts. I mean, that would be Phil's field, really.
So adjusting your doses in real time based on how the patient's responding.
Okay. And how often is it the case that there's not enough morphine to manage the pain? Is there always enough?
I think, there are genetic reasons. Sometimes we inherit so-called polymorphisms in genes that are important in mediating pain relief from morphine, and you might be one of those very unlucky people who don't get any benefit from morphine or codeine.
Wow.
But it's a pretty small percentage of people.
And there would be other drugs that would be available for that person.
Alternatives.
Yeah. But it may be a future Pello talk to get a palliative care specialist on, who would be able to give you some of those different conditions and the different types of drugs, because we always talk commonly about morphine, but there's a number of other ones that would be available that they would use in different circumstances. As Phil has said, sometimes a person might not be a suitable candidate for morphine.
Now, let's switch from facts, evidence, data and logic to politics and propaganda and partisanship. And I don't know how many other P words I can introduce, but the battle lines are typically drawn fairly early on. I'm actually going to ask, are there undecided people in the West Australian Parliament right now, genuinely undecided, could go either way depending on the merits of the arguments they hear?
Yes, definitely.
How many of them would there be?
Look, in rough numbers, this is very rough exercise, but I would put them into thirds. So you'll have a third.
Okay.
You'll have
Many.
You'll have a third of people that will, no matter what proposal gets put up, it could be the most inherently unsafe regime that's ever been put together. They're voting for it.
Are they the people driving this?
Yeah, absolutely. They
Who
want
are
a
Who
regime.
are the ringleaders?
Well, I think that in the Western Australian media, it's very obvious who the ringleaders are, and they just want a regime in. Then you're going to have a third of people who, no matter what proposals they put up, they're not going to vote for it. I mean, I'm definitely one of them, and the reason why I say that is because I know that it is impossible. It's a legal impossibility to protect people from involuntary euthanasia as soon as you allow voluntary euthanasia. So it wouldn't matter what regime they put up. I know that it's inherently unsafe.
There will be casualties.
And then you'll have a third of people who are genuinely undecided, and most probably, in fairness to them, it will be because they have not had the time to think through all of the issues and look at all the research, because this is not a topic that people ordinarily talk about. You know, when you go and have a barbecue on a Saturday with your friends, how many times during your childhood did you ever talk about euthanasia and assisted suicide? I'd hasten to suggest it might be zero. And that's normal. So,
and I love politics, but I don't think we've discussed it around any barbecues.
No, exactly. And so it's normal that a member of parliament, when they're newly elected, won't have thought about these issues. They won't have had a history in it. Indeed, that was my story. When I came in 2009, this was not a topic that I was expert on, but there was a bill that came into the parliament on this, and so within 12 months you very quickly had to come up to speed, because no one's going to tell you how to vote. You've got a conscience vote on this one. So then you do your research, and that bill was defeated 24-11.
So very practically, what can a West Australian do to influence their local representative, their candidate, or their upper house members to vote for justice and for against the fallacy that there's any such thing as a good law for euthanasia?
So every Western Australian has one lower house representative and 6 upper house representatives. Every Western Australian has that. And they should be communicating with those 7 members of parliament that represent them. There's absolutely no point in sending an email or registering a phone call or trying to have a meeting with a representative from another region. You're wasting their time and you're wasting your time. But if you are communicating with one of your 7 representatives, that's all you can do. And all Western Australians...
What's an effective way that communication happens? I'm under the impression that trying to argue with them is a waste of time, rather just registering, this is what it takes to represent me.
It will depend on the individual. So, say for instance, someone was to communicate with me, they would be best off just registering what their opinion is. Clearly, in my case, they would be wasting
You've got a
their time,
well-formed opinion.
trying to persuade me otherwise, because with all due respect to them, I will have spent many countless hours and weeks and months researching this. Sadly enough, but that's just been my lot. But for there will be many other MPs who won't have had that opportunity or desire or passion, and yes, you could sit down and try and persuade them. There would be no problem with that.
If somebody just wanted to write a brief email without being experts on the topic, what do you think the main concerns they should register with undecided parliamentarians would be?
If it was me, I would send a simple message out to say that in every other jurisdiction there have been wrongful deaths. So why would we want to do the same thing in Western Australia? Why would we want to create a regime where casualties are guaranteed? I would not complicate it much further than that, because the reality is the other side cannot rebut that. They can ignore it, they can lie, but they can't rebut it.
Why do the media promote heavily the arguments on one side of this debate And is there any hope of, do you feel the anti-position, the negative position has been adequately represented?
It never is in the media. No, never is. But remember, the media is really effectively the same now in 2019 that it was in 2010 when we last had the debate, and the bill was defeated then 24 votes to 11. So really, irrespective of what the media do or don't do, where Western Australians are best off sending their advocacy is to the members of Parliament. Don't try and win over the journalist. The journalist is looking for the popular story to try and sell as many newspapers as possible. You're best off communicating directly with your representative.
Any thoughts on the mainstream media, Bill?
Well, we know on this and every issue they are of the left simply because the majority in the media are leftist, and we have all kinds of studies and surveys that prove that very point. You know, how many here have voted Labour and so on, or are members of the Labour Party in the media. So, yeah, you're not going to get far with the media. We were talking the 30-30-30 mix in politics. You could step back and look at society at the larger point of view. Probably on this, on so many issues, you'd have about 10% hardcore pro-euthanasia, another 10% hardcore anti-euthanasia, and probably a good 80 to 90% of, well, Western Australians or Australians as a whole who really don't know where they stand. So if it comes to voting on something, or at least, well, your voters determine who becomes your elected representative. If you're trying to reach them, you're not going to reach that 10 to 15% hardcore pro-euthanasia, but you do have this very large group in the middle who really don't know where they stand, and we need to give them the arguments. And again, it's hard to do. As we just said, the media is basically pushing one side. So you get the alternative media, you get your own websites, you get your own books, you have pro-life groups. But we have to do all we can to get that great bulk in the middle who probably could be persuaded if they actually heard some good arguments, and they're not going to get it from the SBS, ABC, and so on.
Interestingly, in the inquiry that we had over the 12 months here in Western Australia, and this is a piece of information that really hasn't got out into the mainstream media at all, the majority of submissions that were received, and there were more than 600 that were received, the majority were opposed. And yet
70?
it was approximately 60-40. And that fact is never ever discussed in the media. Oh well, it's just ignored. And yet you still have
What's
7.
a normal kind of response submissions, normal quantity of submissions to a...
Oh, no, any of that. No. I'm on an inquiry at the moment on a completely different piece of legislation, and I think you could count how many submissions on one hand.
Really?
So, it really depends on the issue. Naturally, I mean, in fairness, this is a very emotive issue.
It is, yeah.
But that's an extraordinary amount of submissions. And, as I say, the majority were opposed.
Yeah.
So that's an inconvenient fact, so it just gets ignored. This is also an inquiry where the minutes, remember I said earlier that I was the only one of the 8 members to be on at every hearing and every meeting. The minutes of the meeting have been suppressed. Now this is highly, highly irregular under the normal conventions of the Parliament for these committees. Those minutes are always released and made publicly available. To the point of I moved a motion in the Parliament to try and have them released, and the motion was defeated. The government made sure that the motion was defeated. So
what are they trying to hide?
Well,
surely that's the obvious
well,
question.
I obviously know the answer to that question, but I'm prohibited from discussing what's in the minutes. Hence
Really?
why it would be good to have it out there. But
So not only do they suppress the minutes, they suppress you even talking about
well,
it.
in fairness, it is right that a member of Parliament who's on a committee is not able to reveal what has happened in the committee other than what's on the public record. That's a normal standard practice.
Okay.
There's nothing wrong with that.
Good.
And I think that's an important convention for the parliamentarians to maintain, to uphold the integrity of the committee process.
Mm-hmm.
But it is not ordinarily the case that the minutes are revealed, except for this committee. Tied up in secrecy.
Yeah.
Mm.
Bill, what ideology philosophy, worldview is driving or frequently found at the root of these kinds of agendas?
Well, again, we can do the secular or the religious take on this. I mean, they end up at the same place, but obviously what we call the secular humanist kind of worldview that dominates the media, that dominates much of the judiciary, much of our politics. And there's good reason for that. Had we a bit of time, I was part of the hippie culture, the radical 60s in my youth. I had a bit of a wild youth. And we were quite deliberate.
I can picture that.
We targeted politics. We targeted journalists. You know, we took courses in all these things knowing we had to take over. If we wanted to win, you know, we gave up the external revolution with guns and we decided internal evolution with, well, the long march through the institutions is how one famous Italian Marxist put it. Get into the institutions, take them over from within, and that's this whole secular humanist worldview. And sadly, that's exactly what's happened in the last 40 or 50 years. So that's one way to look at it. If you're a Christian, well, there's this famous proverb that says, all those who hate me, that is God, love death. There's a correspondence between those who hate God tend to, well, you know, what does Jesus said about the devil? He comes to kill and to destroy and to steal.
That proverb's observable.
Well, absolutely. Well, there's a Chesterton talked about the principle of one of the most verifiable things we have is the idea of original sin, that we tend to, you know, we can see it everywhere on display. And I think this is your perfect example. Do you have on fire, dedicated, godly Christians pushing the pro-youth? I mean, sure, you got some radical lefty religious types who always get, but you know, who's mostly driving this? They tend to be atheists or secularists and very hostile. Well, as we said, Singer, great example, really dishes on religion, the Judeo-Christian worldview. So there is that whole correspondence going on there.
I want to give all of you a chance for a final statement or comment before we wrap up this evening. But there's one final question. It's just so practical. I want to include it. And Nick, this is your court. How do I find out who my representatives are and how to contact them?
Yeah.
Great question.
It is a great question. Well, I'd be quite happy for anyone who wants to do advocacy on this to contact me if they're unsure. So they can always email me, and obviously my details are very easily accessible from the Parliament website. But if you go on the Parliament website, there's also a mechanism there for you to effectively put in your postcode, and then it will tell you who your representatives are. So there is a facility online, but if all else fails, contact me and I'm quite happy to point them in the right direction.
Can we put your contact details beneath
Absolutely.
the video?
No problem.
Okay, so you can have a look beneath the video description, and there'll be links on how to contact Nick there. Nick, let's start with you and we'll go down the line. Final thoughts, final comments on the logic, the merit, your arguments, appeal to the audience.
Yeah. Well, the final thing that I'll say is that the stakes are very high here. The stakes cannot be higher than creating a regime where if it goes wrong, there's no second chances. And we know from the international experience and indeed from our own Australian experience that there will be casualties. So this is not just a case of theoretical risks. This is the known lived experience in Australia and other jurisdictions that tells us that casualties are guaranteed. And in those circumstances, the risks are far too great. Why? Because the consequences are final. So I would really just implore any Western Australian who's prepared to be clear-headed about this matter and consider the overwhelming facts that they contact their representative.
Phil?
Yeah, I guess as an academic, my instinct is to recommend people go and read a book. And the book I would recommend, if you're even on the pro-euthanasia side, I think you have to read Robert J. Lifton's The Nazi Doctors, which is a classic. Robert J. Lifton was a psychiatrist from, I think, New York, And he realised in the 1970s that many of the doctors in the Third Reich were reaching the end of their lives, and he went and conducted serious, sort of robust, scholarly interviews with all the surviving doctors and subjected them to sort of psychoanalysis, basically, to try and work out what was driving them, how did they go from being healing profession into killing profession in the Third Reich. And I know we're not supposed to bring up the N word, and people get very upset about that, but just read Dr. Lifton's book, because it's one of the most chilling books I've ever read, but also one, and a lot of it, he believes, the madness of the Third Reich really was a consequence of, in the 1890s, German professors started writing scholarly books defending euthanasia, and it just creates this corrupt societal environment, and who knows what sort of crazy economic and political crises our societies are going to go through, just as Germany did in the failure of the Weimar Republic in the 20s and 30s. We don't know what's ahead of our society. Let's not leave ourselves vulnerable to these mad reactionary political movements by transgressing a really sacred value of the value of every human life by legalising some people to kill other people.
It's a great recommendation, because it's established wisdom that those who are ignorant of history are doomed to repeat it.
Exactly.
And that's a section of history that we swore as a planet never again.
Yeah.
For good reason. Phil,
Well,
obviously another book you should read.
Well, that's right. Another one. I think it's cheaper than Lifton. Anyway, and it's easier to get than Lifton's. But
It's back in print now.
is it good? Good. I got a copy. Look, I tend to always run with the bigger picture. What we're doing, in a sense, here is looking at the smaller picture. We want to keep euthanasia from being legalized in WA. Very important issue. But as part of a much bigger battle, and sadly, politics tends to flow downstream from culture. So if your culture is largely secularized and predisposed to death and destruction, well, guess what? It's going to manifest in politics, in legislative decisions, in votes, in parliament. So in a sense, the bigger battle lies outside of all the tremendous work that Nick and others are doing, and it's something all of us have to get involved in, and that's the big picture of the long term. I mentioned the long march through the institutions that Gramsci talked about. They knew it was going to take a long time for this to happen. But a lot of us think, oh, well, I signed a petition once on euthanasia, so I kind of did my bit for the year. No, that's actually not going to cut it. We have to be involved for the long haul. We have to fight this battle like mad, but we have to fight a whole lot of other things, part of the bigger challenge that we face. So, your rest will come in the next life, but now we've got a lot of work to do. And I always mention Wilberforce, right? Spent 46 years fighting the slave trade. 3 days before he died, he finally saw the fruit of his labors. So I'm not sure anybody here has been fighting, even Nick, for 46 years on this one.
Wow.
So we got a lot of work yet to do, and by God's grace, we may win a few.
Yeah, brilliant. Well, thank you very much, gentlemen, for your company on the couch tonight. Apologies we couldn't find a couch, but I only had so much excess baggage I could bring on the flight.
Sure.
Thank you very much to the Pello Talk partners for your partnership and your making these kind of interviews and ongoing work possible. And if you'd like to become a Pello Talk partner, or if you'd like to subscribe to my newsletters, you can check all of these videos out, as well as a whole lot more, at davepello.com. You can also follow me on YouTube, Facebook, Twitter and Instagram at Dave Pello. And I strongly encourage you to subscribe to the emails, because I expect to be kicked off social media any day from now. It'll be our only means of communication, and I really don't bombard your inbox, so it will be useful for you there. There's lots of previous episodes. You can have a look at the interview I've done already with Bill Muhlenberg on this. We actually take apart and forensically analyse Andrew Denton's, one of his speech to the National Press Club, and that's a great thing, because he actually gets to talk about euthanasia and his arguments for, and then Bill answers them one by one, carefully and methodically. So there's good resources on the Pello Talk website that go back a long way. That perennial subjects such as euthanasia just keeps coming up over and over and over again. Now, speaking of important subjects, I have to mention that I've written an article and a call to arms recently about what I think is the single most important election issue facing us ahead of the West Australian election, the federal election. And that is the Labor Party's decision to make abortion a federal issue. And they've decided that federalism no longer matters, and the laws of South Australia and New South Wales must be changed by Tanya Plibersek, and they're going to legalise, liberalise abortion around the nation, build an abortion clinic in Tasmania, and make the procedure free everywhere, which they're fooling themselves if they think it won't result in more. Yet again, we see the enemies of Christianity, God, and Western traditional values attacking life and advocating death. And surely this is an issue that requires every single person of good conscience to no longer sit on the sidelines, but to get involved. We need at least 1,000 people in every electorate to write to their candidates, not just the ones they like, but even the ones they disagree with, and register your values. Become an undecided voter genuinely, and make sure that the person who is going to best represent your vote, your values, doesn't only get your vote, but gets your full support to win the election. And that's the only way we're going to make politicians work for us instead of being taken for granted. And that's their job. And so thank you for watching, and hope you subscribe to the emails, and I'll see you in the next episode.